Thank you very much for coming. I look forward to this lecture by Dr. Sethupathy. And I wanted to encourage you to stay afterwards for a reception, because I talked with Dr. Moreland, who heads the honors program, and she said, well, students don't really like lectures that much. They like more personal interaction with the speaker. And so Praveen has agreed to stay afterward. We're going to have a reception back there to give you an excuse to stay around. And please ask him questions, talk to him. He's very willing to talk with you. So, and he has a whole hour because we aren't having dinner until 6:30. So he has an entire hour to talk with you. Okay. The person introducing Dr. Sethupathy is Lisa Dowling, who's the Associate Dean of Arts and Sciences, but she's sick. But she gave me her right. So I'm going to read what Lisa wrote. So Dr. Sethupathy is Chair of Biomedical Sciences, Professor of Physiological Genomics, and Director of the Center for Vertebrate Genomics at Cornell University, where he leads a research lab focused on genomic approaches to understand physiology and human disease. He received his BA from Cornell University and his PhD in genomics from University of Pennsylvania. And he said when he was young, when he was at Penn, he often drove past Villanova, so he's happy to actually step on campus. After completing a postdoctoral fellowship at the National Human Genome Research Institute under the mentorship of then NIH Director Dr. Francis Collins, he moved in 2011 to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill as an assistant professor in the Department of Genetics. That same year, he was selected by Genome Technology as one of the nation's top 25 rising young investigators in genomics. In 2017, he returned to Cornell University as an associate professor. Dr. Sethupathy has authored nearly 150 peer-reviewed publications in scientific journals such as PNAS and Cell and Science, and has served as a reviewer for over 50 different journals. Additional honors include a Faculty Merit Award for Outstanding Teaching and Mentoring, the prestigious American Diabetes Association Pathway to Stop Diabetes Research Accelerator, which is awarded to only 3 people per year, and the inaugural Boehringer Ingelheim Award for Excellence in Summer Research Mentorship. Dr. Sethupathy is an advocate for thoughtful discussion at the interface of science and faith. He has served on the advisory board on the Dialogue of Science, Ethics, and Religion in the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, serves on the board of BioLogos, is a frequent speaker for the BioLogos Voice Program and the Veritas Forum, as well as a mentor in the Veritas Faculty Scholars Program. I wanted to end my introduction by reading to you something I found in Dr. Sethupathy's Cornell University webpage. There he states, quote, "Teaching and mentoring are my first passions. I am firmly committed to serving as a research mentor for undergraduate and graduate students, and I'm particularly passionate about helping students grow not only as scientists, but also as artful and articulate communicators of their scientific work. Exchange of research ideas and goals, both with scientific and lay audiences, is extremely important, and I have deeply enjoyed the opportunity to help train students to improve their skills in this area. The most rewarding moments of my career so far have come in those times when I realized how much my students have grown, not only as critical thinkers, but also as effective communicators." And the title of Dr. Sethupathy's talk is Stardust and Wonder. And we welcome Dr. Sethupathy.
Thank you so much. It's great to see you all here. I appreciate you taking time out of your Thursday evening. I know there's probably a lot that you could be doing. So there you go. Can you hear me? All right. So I do appreciate your presence here. And I just want to reiterate that my favorite part of these kinds of events are the opportunity to interact with you one-on-one or in small group settings. So I promise you I don't bite. And I'm more than happy to chat with you afterwards if there's anything interesting to you in what I shared today, or anything even somewhat related to what we talked about that's on your mind, or that you're thinking about. Really happy to interact with you. I want to thank Bob and the entire organizing committee of the Lamb Lecture to give me this privilege and honor to speak to you all today. I'm really grateful to be here. As Dr. Steyer mentioned, I've driven past Villanova quite a number of times, especially when I used to live in Chicane, not far from here, when I was a graduate student at Penn, but never had occasion to actually come inside campus. It's actually the first time that I've been at Villanova, and I'm thrilled to be here. The title of my lecture today is Stardust and Wonder. And the main topic is really this topic of human uniqueness. What makes us human? And before I dive in, I think it's fair that you get a little bit of a sense of who I am, not just my bio, but a little bit about me, a little bit something deeper. I am a Christian. I'm a scientist. I have a Hindu background, Indian ancestry, Canadian birth, and American citizenship. Before Ithaca, New York, where I live right now, I've lived in southeastern India, Ontario, Canada, and a number of places on the east coast of the US, including Philadelphia. In fact, I have to say here that I just came from dropping off my oldest, who's starting his freshman year at the University of Chicago. And I came straight from there to Villanova campus. And it occurred to me as I landed here that I am 4 minutes down the road from the birth center in Bryn Mawr where he was born. So it feels like a full circle moment for me. So obviously this is, a lot to unpack, and I'm not going to get into most of those parts of who I am today. But what is most relevant for today is that as a scientist, I'm firmly committed to the pursuit of what we call empirical knowledge, making observations and gathering tangible data to test my hypotheses. But on the other hand, I am also a person of deep faith in Christ and in truths that I believe science alone cannot illuminate. I've committed my life to both science and faith, and as far as I know, they don't occupy separate parts of my brain or represent multiple personalities. They really do seem to commingle harmoniously as partners. That doesn't mean that sometimes they ask hard questions of one another, but they have been beautiful partners in my life. That said, though, there is some confusion out there. Some suggest that science is the sole arbiter of truth, and that it's our only foundation for human value and purpose. And then there are others who are suspicious and wary of science because they believe that there may be an agenda among many scientists, particularly those in university settings, to marginalize faith. But it's worth pointing out, as loud as that culture war can seem sometimes, that if viewed through the lens of individuals throughout history, that culture war is actually a relatively recent one. Science and faith have long been very productive co-laborers in the pursuit of truth. And if you want to learn more about this rich history, I encourage you to study the lives of many prominent Christian thinkers and scholars over the past millennium, including the great Franciscan friar Robert Bacon, one of the earliest advocates of the scientific method, or Michael Faraday, who established electromagnetic theory, or Blaise Pascal, a pioneer in math and physics, or Gregor Mendel, who is widely viewed as a father of modern genetics. These individuals didn't fall into science and then just sort of hope that science and faith could be partners in the pursuit of truth. They were actually, if you read their works, they were driven to science by an insatiable desire to learn about and celebrate a God of order and creativity. The scientific lens, whatever it happened to reveal, it didn't push God out of their worldviews. Instead, it gave them a new window into just how amazing God is. To paraphrase the Belgic Confession of Faith, the universe is like a beautiful book, the study of which makes us ponder the invisible things of God. So with that, what has science taught us about who we are, about human uniqueness or distinctiveness? So this evening, I want to highlight 3 lessons from science. And at first, these lessons may seem bleak. It may seem like I'm saying there's nothing really special to us humans. But stick with me. At the very end of the lecture, I hope to have convinced you that when these lessons are seen through the lens of Christian faith, they're actually really inspiring. So the first lesson is that we are not as biologically distinct from other species as we may think. To tackle this question of human distinctiveness, one approach scientists have taken is at the behavioral level. Tool making, empathy, deception, conflict resolution. These have all been at some point or another suggested as unique markers of humanity. But they've since been identified in species that we tend to think are not that closely related to us, even birds and hyenas. The more we learn, the fuzzier it seems to get in terms of how we sort of cleanly distinguish ourselves behaviorally from other species. We certainly differ in degree to which we exhibit some traits. A prominent example of this is cooperativity. But the general principles are not uniquely human. Some have tried to define human uniqueness from an anatomical perspective or a morphological perspective, but this too has proven problematic. For example, it's long been known that humans have some asymmetries in our brain that contribute to certain cognitive functions. For many decades, these features were thought to be uniquely human, and much was made of this. But in the last 15 years or so, an increasing number of studies have shown that this left-right brain asymmetries are shared by many other vertebrates and even some invertebrates. So there goes that special feature. This isn't to say that there's nothing at all that separates us biologically, of course. For example, this is sort of a cool example, at the cellular level, something very interesting has been noted about human dendrites. Those of you studying neuroscience will know what dendrites are. They're these kind of arborous extensions of a neuron that help to communicate signals in the brain. It turns out that human dendrites are much bigger and much longer than other animals, even chimps and monkeys. And it's been suggested that this distinction could hold the clues to the cognitive capabilities of humans. I think this is really interesting. Certainly it merits deeper study. But this is really just another example of a difference in degree, which isn't particularly satisfying, even for many of the scientists who I work with, for the question of what really conceptually separates us from other creatures. The second lesson is that we are not as physically independent from other species as we assume. So the first was we're not as biologically distinct, but the second is we're not as physically independent as we like to think. As many of you probably already know, one of the most remarkable discoveries in human biology is that our bodies, each one of our bodies, are home to tens of trillions of microorganisms. So if you put that in another way, slightly more than half the cells in the human body are not human at all. Most of these microbes, they're bacteria, they're viruses. But did you know that these microbes inside us include fungus too? You may be used to thinking about fungus in the context of a medical condition, like a yeast infection or something like that. Or maybe something we eat, right, like edible mushrooms, or even something we drink, like beer. But across the human population, hundreds of fungal species take up normal residence inside of our body. And amazingly, these bacteria, viruses, and fungi, they work together to promote our good health and physical well-being. And what's more is that they seem to play a role in shaping things like our emotions, how anxious we feel, our mood, and our behaviors. many things that we would say are human behaviors. We wouldn't be who we are, though, without the bacteria and fungus inside us. Another example comes from examining DNA, which I do routinely in my lab. You might expect that at least our DNA is fully human, right? We each have human DNA. But actually, speckled throughout our genomes are genetic sequences that we believe originated from viruses. And this is because certain viruses, when they infect a host, they can integrate their genetic material into that of the host. And in fact, at least 10%, speaking conservatively, of our human genome represents sequences from viruses that have integrated into our DNA over time. So even at the genetic level, you could say we are 1/10 virus. And amazingly, this is where it gets really cool. Viral DNA may have actually shaped some aspects of human biology that we take for granted today. For example, there's growing evidence to suggest that pieces of viral DNA may contribute to the development of the human placenta. It always gives me goosebumps. It's fascinating to me. Viral DNA may have helped bring about an organ that is critical for nourishing a growing baby in the human womb. It's fascinating to me. So we are not as physically independent from other species as we often assume. The third lesson is that we are not as materially special as we like to sometimes feel. Carl Sagan, one of the world's most brilliant astrophysicists and a fellow Cornellian, once said that the cosmos is within us. We are made of star stuff. He meant this quite literally, because we indeed are made of the stuff of stars. 99% of our physical bodies is comprised of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. The remaining 1% includes important elements, calcium, magnesium, iron, and so on. Where do these elements come from? The answer is, as Carl Sagan said, from the stars. Early in their lives, stars are comprised mostly of hydrogen. Nuclear fusion of hydrogen leads to the production of helium. And a special process of helium fusion brings about carbon. In very large stars, subsequent addition of helium elements can give rise to oxygen, magnesium, and iron. During supernovas, which are essentially these magnificent explosions of large stars, all these elements are released into interstellar space, providing the raw material for new stars, new planets, even life on some of these new planets. So everything we're made of was made first inside stars. So to summarize this part, science has taught us that we are strikingly similar in a lot of ways to other creatures. We're surprisingly dependent on other species, including fungus, and even more, we're made of stardust. The bottom line is that biology and science in general, it has brought to light a fundamental connectedness among different life forms and even links all of us intimately to the air we breathe and the earth on which we walk. Some have argued that this points to our insignificance. In fact, Stephen Hawking famously said, "We are just chemical scum on a moderate-sized planet orbiting round a very average star in the outer suburb of one among 100 billion galaxies." This is not unlike the sentiment shared by Carl Sagan, who said, "Who are we humans? We find that we live on an insignificant planet of a humdrum star, lost in a galaxy tucked away in some forgotten corner of a universe in which there are far more galaxies than people." Bummermen. Sagan and Hawking are taking big jumps here, right? From talking about the facts of science and what it reveals about our connectedness to inferring something about the significance of humankind. That's a moral statement. They suggest that our material or physical place in the universe shows that we are not that important. We are not that significant. Are they right? If science is the sole arbiter of truth and value, I might be tempted to agree. But as it turns out, science only offers an explanation for one dimension of reality. This is really demonstrated elegantly by an illustration provided by John Polkinghorne, who's a prominent theoretical physicist at Cambridge, and then became an Anglican priest. There are very few people in the modern era who can speak to the intersection of science and faith in the way that John can. Before his passing in 2021, he was considered one of the foremost thought leaders on the topic of science and faith. His illustration starts with a question. What is the explanation for a tea kettle that is boiling on a stove? One explanation is that the burning gas heats the water, but that only answers the question of how. Another explanation is that the water is boiling because someone wanted tea. And of course, it's tea and not coffee, because John's British. That answers the question why. Science can tell us what happens, but that's only part of the story. It can't tell us the purpose. For that, we need to look beyond science. It doesn't necessarily mean there is an answer somewhere else, but it does mean that science is agnostic with respect to that. And we can't use science to make claims about an area that it is not powered to answer. Science does not constrain us to look only to science in our exploration of human distinctiveness. To be a scientist is to respect not only the powers of science, which I'm lucky to interact with every day, but also to appreciate its limitations, which I think sometimes gets lost on us when we do science. The atheist philosopher Daniel Dennett, he once said, like other animals, we have built-in desires to reproduce and to do pretty much whatever it takes to achieve this goal. But we also have creeds and the ability to transcend our genetic imperatives. Our ability to devote our lives to something we deem more important than our own personal welfare is one of the things that set us aside from the rest of the animal world. Hard not here to think about St. Thomas of Villanova. Dennett goes on to say that he believes science will one day provide the explanation for this. But I have to ask, could it be that, like the boiling kettle, science only has part of the answer? Specifically, the context of this lecture, what might the Christian scriptures have to offer about human distinctiveness? Well, to start with, I believe that we have to be really careful to not read the Bible as though it is a scientific text. That said, though, it is very striking to me that humans are sometimes described in exactly the same terms as other animals. In Genesis 1, humans and animals are both created on day 6. We don't even get a separate day, guys. In Genesis 2, humans and other creatures are both referred to as nefesh chaya, which is often translated as a living soul or a living organism. So many Bible scholars have argued that even this idea of the soul, we need to wrestle with whether that is even uniquely human. Also in Genesis 2, humans are created from the dust of the ground, which is exactly the way the formation of other animals is also described. Moreover, the book of Ecclesiastes says, just as the animals from dust we came, and to dust we shall return. When it comes to the stuff we're made of, whether we're talking about genetics or Genesis, it seems we can't escape that we're basically dust, maybe stardust. So then, according to Genesis, is there anything at all that sets humans apart? Here's the magic. During the telling of how the universe came to be, the phrase image of God is used for only one species, us. The Hebrew word used for image in Genesis is the same one that is used to describe royal images that a king might set up all across the kingdom when he was not physically present. Bible scholar, theologian, and I'm lucky to say a really good friend of mine, Dr. Richard Middleton, he defines the image of God in his book, The Liberating Image, as, quote, the royal office of human beings as God's representatives and agents in the world. We're called to manifest and channel the character and the presence of God. Priestly service toward the rest of creation, you might say. So my reading here is that the image of God is not primarily a biological feature, but rather a vocational calling that has been gifted to us. I don't want to be reductionist about the image of God or say that I have all the answers for what it means. But there is a distinction there that I think is important, or that has been very helpful for me. In other words, according to Genesis, it doesn't seem like it's so much about what we're made of or anything we may have done ourselves, but rather what we are called to that fundamentally sets us apart from all of the rest of biological life. So consider Psalm 8, 3 through 5. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is mankind that you are mindful of them, human beings that you care for them? You've made them a little lower than the angels and crowned them with glory and honor. The great American novelist Marilyn Robinson wrote the following. This section of Psalm 8 closes the infinite distance between God and humankind by confounding all notions of scale. If the great heavens are the work of God's fingers, what is small and mortal man? The poem answers its own question this way. Man is crowned with honor and glory by God. He is in a singular sense what God has made him because of the dignity God has conferred upon him, splendor of a higher order. In other words, the significance of humanity does not arise primarily from our material bodies, nor our physical place in the universe, as Hawking and Sagan assumed, but rather in the value God himself chooses to place on us. Why does he value us? It turns out that it has very little to do with who we are, and everything to do with who he is. He chooses to value us. He even chooses to partner with us as his image bearers and invites us, this is the neat part that kind of links it back to science, he invites us to stand in awe at the things that he has done. Psalm 65:8, you see this invitation. The whole earth is filled with awe at your wonders. Where morning dawns, where evening fades, you call forth songs of joy. Job 37, stop and consider, it says, stop and consider the wondrous works of God. Do you know how God lays his command upon them and causes the lightning of his cloud to shine? Do you know how he balances the clouds and the many wondrous works of him? Psalm 139, for you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful, and I know that full well. By the way, remember when I said earlier that pieces of viral DNA may have helped bring about an organ that is critical for nourishing a growing baby in the human womb? To me, that doesn't take away from God's authorship of our lives. Instead, it adds this wonderfully surprising color to the truth of Psalm 139, that God knit us together in our mother's wombs. Who is to say that God cannot use viruses to accomplish this? These verses, they reveal a core truth of the Christian faith, that we're called to wonder at what he has made. Humankind, it's that unique slice of creation that gets to delight in creation right alongside our Creator. We, uniquely, get to peer into and make known what Ephesians 3:10 calls the manifold wisdom of God. Human distinctiveness is less about the material stuff we're made of, although I think that's important and interesting, and I've dedicated my life to studying it. But that's not where the distinctiveness is found. It is more about the unique calling and experience of drawing nearer to God in the study of all that he has made. The opportunity to do science and to wonder while doing it is really something special. For me, at the end of the day, what I've been talking about, this is really what the scientific enterprise is about. Properly viewed in the light of our calling as images of God, the exploration of the natural world, or science, it doesn't detract from my humanity. It encourages it. It persuades me almost every day that I'm doing science to open my eyes to the overabundance, almost prodigal amount of created things all around us. The sheer vastness of the created order, the diversity and complexity of created things, that's awe-inspiring. We're meant to explore, to wonder, to be in awe in a way that I believe no other animal is. As creatures made in the image of God, God extends an invitation to consciously enjoy creation. To me, that's the definition of science. An invitation to not only stand and stare at the wonder and mystery of the created world, but also to explore it with delight and anticipation. This might be a good opportunity for a quick aside. One of my favorite scientists is Johannes Kepler. And if you read one of his many mathematical treatises as he's sort of mapping the laws of planetary motion and many other things, at the very beginning he says that it is his calling, essentially, to be a priest of science. That's basically, he views himself as a priest, even though we would call him a scientist. Right? And he goes on to explain that really what he sees as the purpose of his life is to think God's thoughts after him and then be in awe of it, go and teach it to others, and then celebrate together. Like, that was science for Johannes Kepler, right? Imagine a Nature article starting today with that kind of approach. So, talking so much about awe and wonder, let's respond to this invitation. So in the next part of this lecture, what I'd like to do is I want to share just 2 stories with you, just to get the juices flowing. And these are stories of wonder from my field of genomics. There are many, but I'll just share these 2 with you to give you something to chew on. So the first story of wonder is about what scientists sometimes have called the dark matter of the genome. So the first draft of the human genome, the full complement of DNA found in almost every one of the cells in our human cells of our body, it was completed at the turn of the millennium, a little over 25 years ago. When the announcement was made from the White House, the president at the time referred to the genome as, quote, the most important, most wondrous map ever produced by humankind. The sequencing of the human genome unveiled the instruction booklet for every cell in the body. It's pretty amazing. But we did not know how to interpret the instructions because the language in which it was written was largely foreign to us. What is actually encoded in the genome? It's sort of like finding this parchment that you know is going to reveal all kinds of mysteries of, let's say, human history, but then finding it in a language that we don't know and don't understand, right? So we had to get to work actually decoding the genome and figuring out how it works. What does it actually teach us about the human body? This word genome literally means a compendium of genes, right? A collection of genes. But it turns out we don't have nearly as many genes in our genome as we once thought. Before the genome era of science, we thought maybe we had 100,000 plus genes in the human genome. But by studying the full genome sequence, we've learned that we have, depending on how you count, maybe only about 20,000. Even the genome of rice, the rice we eat, has close to 50,000 genes, almost twice, maybe more than twice, as the human genome. It's now well known, but at the time was a bit shattering. In fact, we now know that, again, depending on exactly how you define genes, they likely constitute only 2% of the human genome. What is encoded in the remaining 98%? That is what was once called the dark matter of the genome. It turns out that a lot of it is filled with little DNA switches, like a light switch or maybe a rheostat or a dial. These dials, they control when and where and how the nearby genes are turned on or off. We knew before the genome era that these dials existed, right? But what we didn't quite appreciate was just how much of the genome they occupy, how many different kinds there are, and how critical they are to bringing about biological complexity. If you think of genes as like tools in a toolkit, it turns out that biological complexity isn't really determined by the number of tools you have, but rather when and where and how you use those tools. I've found this to be sort of an interesting parable for spiritual life. It's not so much how many skills or how many talents I have or you have, but rather when and how we use whatever it is that we do have that helps build the kingdom of heaven, that helps make a difference in the lives of the people around us. The second story that I want to share with you of wonder is this concept of epigenetics. Maybe some of you have come across the notion in your classes. Earlier, I referred to the genome as a set of instructions. Every cell in the body has the same set of instructions, the same DNA. But if that's true, how does a cell in the brain know how to do something different than the cell on my skin or the cell in my liver or pancreas, the colon? It turns out cells don't execute all of the instructions in the DNA. Rather, each one is programmed to know which instructions to execute and which ones to ignore, right? It's almost as though you have instructions from A to Z, and the brain sees all those instructions, and so does the skin cell, but somehow the brain knows I'm really going to only execute A, B, and C, but the skin cell knows I'm really only supposed to execute X, Y, and Z. Right? How does this work? Answering this question is at the heart of the field of epigenetics, and there are entire labs devoted to studying this process and understanding the mechanisms at the molecular level. If you stretched out the DNA from just one cell in your body, take one living cell, right? You take the DNA out of that and you stretched it out, right? Anybody know how long it would be? 6 feet. That's taller than I am, much to my chagrin. If you took the DNA from all of the cells in just one human body and stretched it out, kind of linked it up end to end, it would be hundreds of millions of miles. I've known this for a while, and it gives me goosebumps every time I say it. That is a lot of material, very, very tightly wound and packaged within the cells of just one body. Here's where it gets interesting, even more interesting. Marks, chemical marks, can be made on this packaging material, the packaging material that kind of tightly winds it and fits it inside the nucleus of a cell. Chemical marks can be made on this packaging material to indicate which instructions of the DNA a cell is going to follow. So, for example, if you found mark A, it might mean to the cell, I've got to execute that instruction. But if you found mark B, a different kind of mark there, maybe it tells the cell, leave that one alone. I'm not supposed to execute that instruction, right? The remarkable thing about this is that the environment around us, our lifestyle choices, what we're eating, what we're breathing in, they can actually change these marks, these chemical marks, and thereby change the way that our DNA functions without changing the DNA itself. We're not talking about a mutation. We're used to that idea. Right? You get a mutation in the DNA, it changes the way the DNA works. What we're talking about here is that, let's use the example of diet. Diet can actually influence the patterns of chemical marks that are made on the packaging material of your DNA. And now all of a sudden, where you should have mark A, maybe you have mark B. And that's telling the cell that it shouldn't execute that instruction when it really should be, right? In other words, the environment around us shapes the packaging material of our DNA and directs how our DNA is going to work without altering the DNA at all. There's a really interesting branch of epigenetics now where people are studying whether those marks themselves can be inherited. Again, we're used to the idea that genetic material can be inherited, right? But can the chemical marks that I'm talking about that serve as another layer of instruction to the cells about what instructions to execute and which ones not to, can those also be inherited? There is some beginning evidence to suggest that at least in a limited fashion, they can be, right? That adds a whole nother layer to our understanding of what we pass on to the next generation. So at the beginning of this lecture, I introduced the idea that we are not as biologically distinct from other species as we may think. If seen through the lens of faith, though, this is actually a reminder, to me anyway, that we are part of a family that we're called to tend and care for. There's some Genesis language there too. I also said that we are not as physically independent from other species as we often assume. But again, seen through the lens of our faith, this is a reminder that we actually belong to one ecological body. I mean, we are walking examples of this. Right? We have so many species represented in just one human body. A body with many parts, each with a responsibility toward another. Right? We are helping out these microorganisms as much as they are helping us out and shaping us. And finally, I proposed that we are not as materially special as we like to feel. But again, seen through the lens of faith, this is actually a reminder that we are called to be in awe of the universe in which we live. The next time you read Psalm 19:1, the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands, I hope that you stand in wonder, not only at God's awesome power, but also that in his wisdom, we humans made in the image of God, we're also stardust. The author of the Bible Project, Tim Mackey, he recently said on a BioLogos podcast, humans are meant to represent a mix of both earth and heaven. That's another way of saying stardust and wonder. Science is powerful for better understanding the earth or the stardust part of who we are. But for the heaven or the wonder part, we have to look upward to our Maker, because he is the one who confers upon us a dignity and splendor of a higher order. Thank you very much.
That was a great talk. Are there any questions? We have about 10 minutes for questions.
Yeah, please.
I think the growing relevancy of artificial intelligence kind of plays into this issue of what does it mean to be human. What are your thoughts on how that kind of either clarifies or confuses these uniquely defining aspects of our humanity? And I was almost thinking, like initially I thought that AI was kind of completely separate from humanity, but through your talk I almost gained the perspective that like this use of AI and the development is almost a way of like understanding our world and like using our talents to almost like like what you said about the awe aspect.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are a lot. First of all, great question. For those of you who may not have heard, the question was essentially about how artificial intelligence informs this discussion, basically, about what it means to be human. and to express our humanity. This is a huge topic and huge question. I think you've hit the nail on the head, though, of the thing we're all thinking and talking about right now. We've just formed a committee at Cornell University that is entirely devoted to thinking through how both transformative and disruptive artificial intelligence is to the life of a university. It's changing the way we teach, it's changing the way we prepare students for the future, a future that we're a little unsure about right now in terms of what the distribution of jobs are going to be like. But it's also shaping how we interact with each other. And I think there's a longer term concern there. But I think that if we get taken in by the concern, we'll miss the opportunity. So what I propose is a balanced approach. I rarely ever think that a technology is bad or good. I think it's more in why we're using it and how we're using it, right? So there are a wide number of technologies out there that have been used for terror and horror, but could have also been used for good. So I think it has fundamentally more to do with our condition and how we are choosing to interact with this. Just yesterday, the president of the University of Chicago, in giving the convocation address, addressed this very issue, which I thought was really powerful for the students to hear this. And what he said was that one of the key formations of a student in a university is learning how to ask questions. Ask questions well, and ask them in community, because that's where you learn best. But if that's true, how does AI impact that? Well, one of the things he said was that some research has already shown that how you interact with AI can actually be really informative. How you ask questions of AI can actually lead you in really sort of terrible and offensive directions and really fruitful and interesting discourse. So even there, you need to know how to interact. Right? So we've been focused, I think, on the negative of, oh my gosh, if you're just interacting with a machine all the time, you're going to forget to be able to interact with other humans, and maybe we're going to lose our humanity. We don't want that. I think that's that extreme case. We absolutely have to regulate that. But at the same time, it's not all bad. I think that there are even this notion of asking questions. AI can really be a helpful tool in shaping how we ask questions better. My own son, who's a freshman in college now, decided to do that and interacted with the latest version of ChatGPT over this past summer, going down, like using a decision tree about how to ask questions, right? And then following different paths of that tree to see where ChatGPT ended up. And maybe it'll be different with the next version of ChatGPT, but it was really informative and instructive for him to see how the way you ask questions actually shapes the kind of answers that you get. And when you do this 1,000 times, you have enough data to actually be able to identify patterns, doing machine learning and data science. And he actually ended up finding that to be really valuable for interacting with people and recognizing and realizing that the way he asks questions could be really leading and even subconsciously help them to answer in one way or another. Right? So that's a beautiful example of how it can actually help shape our humanity and help our humanity because, but it comes down to his motivation. His desire to do it was driven by a desire to connect with people better. So I think it's going to come down to how and why we are using these tools because they could be powerful and transformative. Thanks for the question. Yeah.
I was wondering what you think about our current mechanistic view of science and whether that's the limitation preventing us from seeing faith as integrated into science. Because I think ancient science had a more like, there were essences, there's probably purpose and design. We don't see science in the same way anymore. And how could potentially we go back to those foundations?
Wow, it's really insightful. I haven't heard it phrased exactly that way, but we're actually talking about that very concept a lot these days. Not stemming from a desire to actually integrate faith better, but from a totally different perspective, which is that scientists are starting to feel that the systems that we have set up are obsessed about mechanism. And that if we don't have a mechanism for something, that it really probably, it may as well not be real, right? And you're right that a lot of science prior to mechanism was observational. And we called that science, right? But somehow we've relegated that to something else now, right? And we almost deride it by calling it just merely phenomenological. You just saw something, right? But it could be a really cool something that you really couldn't have seen without a certain perspective or a certain technology available to you or whatnot. And so it should still be within the purview of science. We've gone so far off the beaten path that even secular scientists are now saying that, and again, not because they want to integrate faith, but because they realize that we're maybe just doing one aspect of science, and we've elevated that and we've put it on a pedestal. And Nature, Cell, and Science they'll literally tell you if you submit your work there. More often than not, they'll come back and they'll say, where's the mechanism for this, right? And so then you got to spend the next 8 years figuring out some kind of a mechanism. Sometimes leads to bad science because you're just trying to hammer out something and send it back, right? And then try to claim that it's the mechanism when in fact figuring out a mechanism for this phenomenon might be extraordinarily complex and take 3 lifetimes and 100 careers. Right? So, I totally agree with you. I think that tunnel vision that we have adopted in science, it does instinctively make people feel that if I can't come up with a mechanism for something, it's not real, right? Ancient cultures, if you look at the way that the word that they had for truth, these are like weighty words where it's like the thing that holds all things together, right? Like that's where like the concept of today, when we talk about truth in the scientific community, it's like a collection of facts for which we have determined some mechanistic basis. So we've really just like honed in on one small aspect of truth and like seeing that as our whole world. Yeah.
Do you think it is possible that not just this integration between faith and science, because when I try to tell people that science could perhaps within its purview give explanations for transcendent experiences, perhaps like even the field of psychology, which I am in, it is one area where it has become a lot more empirical and going away from whatever could be innate in us. But if we go back to certain foundations that were there in ancient science, perhaps it wouldn't be oxymoronic to say that science can explain these experiences. It's not beyond the purview of science.
Yeah, I think that that's true. But I also think it's true that there is a limit to what science can explain, and that's okay. Our worldview that only that which is explained by science is true and real also needs to be questioned, I think. Right? So there are some things that are probably outside of the purview of science. Daniel Dennett's idea that we often seem to rise above our genetic imperatives, I don't think that is going to be fully explained by science. And that's okay, right? I think science might have a slice or a part of the answer and not the whole answer. And I think that's important to really appreciate too. Even if you are not a person of faith or a secular scientist, I think you do your best science when you appreciate both the powers and the limitations of what you're doing. Yeah.
We've talked a lot about the importance of science and working with that wonder that we can have, whether it's secular or in faith. I kind of wanted to see like how that would contend with people who are perhaps more like neurodivergent or even perhaps people that have mental illnesses because they might not have those same, I want to wonder of this or I want to explore science this way. So how do you cut that?
It's a fantastic question. So for those who didn't hear, the question is about for individuals who may have mental health conditions or are neurodivergent and who may not interface with or experience the world around them the way that I might, for example, right? How does this relate to them? How is this pertinent to them? It's a beautiful question. And I actually think that's sort of, if I had another several pages to my notes, I think I would go there, right? Because this is actually one of the dangers of thinking about our uniqueness or our distinctiveness as purely biological or material. Right? There are some people, and I don't mean neurodivergence per se, but there are some people who have certain really severe mental health conditions that disable them from being able to have executive function or cognitive capabilities like you or I might, right? Does that mean they're any less the image of God than I am? Absolutely not. But if I restrict myself to cognitive capabilities of human beings as, a central notion that separates us from other creatures and is a part of what really makes us special, I think we fall into a trap, and that's potentially dangerous in addition to, I think, just not being accurate. Right? But if we think about it more as a calling to experience him and be in awe of him, this is probably best answered with a story. I have a colleague, really close colleague of mine, who has a son who has really severe Down syndrome. The son is in his 40s and still lives with his parents. So moving to talk to my colleague about how he has never seen a human being with a capacity to love like his son. And I bring that up because just because they may not relate with the created order in the way you and I exactly might, right, doesn't mean that they're not in some other really profound and interesting way that we can learn from. I just think, unfortunately, society isn't set up. We're not geared to be looking for what we can learn from them. And often we're just thinking about what we can do to serve them, which is good, and that is proper, and that is appropriate. But there are also things we can learn from them. There are ways in which I think they're relating to God that are maybe harder for us, right? So I think what it does is expand our views of how people might be in awe, how people can stand and stare differently. And I think that's part of why we're all so different. Like, I might even do that a little differently because of my background and culture than you, right? And then we can come together and learn from each other, and there's some richness in that as well, and gives us even deeper perspectives, right? So I think it's the same thing with these situations. Thanks for that question. Yeah.
You mentioned that you live in Canada and India as well as the US. Are these ideas and this compromise between faith and science kind of viewed differently in these places, and how have living in those places influenced your own ideas about this compromise?
What a great question. Again, questioner asks, because I've lived in different places and experienced different cultures, this sort of science and faith and the intersection of the two, are they different here in America relative to some of the other places? It's actually a really important question because some of you may know N.T. Wright. He's an Anglican priest, and he's written a lot of the Resurrection is a really famous book of his, has many other writings. He famously has said, and in talking with him, I learned more of what he meant by this, that throughout his career, he found this culture war between science and faith to be almost a uniquely American problem. But then now he fears that we are getting really good at exporting this problem. Right? So much later in his life and career, he is now noticing, as he travels around the world in his various capacities, finding that this problem now exists elsewhere, where he did not find it 20 years prior, 30 years prior, right? So it's really worrying him that we are exporting this problem. There's a really unique and somewhat tortured history in our country when it comes to science and faith. And there's the Scopes trial that I think people often put as the kind of center point, and that a lot sort of comes out from there. That's definitely true. There are some other strains too. There's a really good book by Ronald Numbers. He's a historian of science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I think came out of a Seventh-day Adventist tradition. I don't believe he's any longer practicing, but extraordinarily knowledgeable and very scholarly on this topic. And by this topic, I mean Christianity in America. He has a book called The Creationists. And he comes from a tradition of young earth creationism himself. And he has evolved from that position. Forgive the pun, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. He's evolved from that position himself, but he is respectful toward it. So, it's a book where he's really trying to genuinely understand, how did this take hold in America in a very unique and special way? And I encourage you to, if this is a topic you're interested in, I encourage you to read it, because I think that was a really significant movement in the science and faith conversation. Now, there are many things outside of that. I don't mean to reduce the science and faith tension in America to just that issue. That was a driving issue for a long time, still remains a point of huge tension. But then over time, it has also been strongly intertwined with our politics. And that's relatively more recent, but that really makes things extraordinarily difficult as well, and gets to the questions of who you trust and why you trust them, right? In a way that just hasn't really happened like that in a lot of other countries. If you look at Hinduism, for example, in India, Hinduism is a little unique because it's not a falsifiable tradition in the sense that, like in Christianity, if we were to say Jesus resurrected, Paul then turns around and says, this is a historical claim. If it didn't happen, we are to be pitied among all people, right? So there's historicity to it, right? And you can test it out. It's falsifiable. Right? Same to some extent with Islam, right? It's relatively recent, and there are historical claims made about X, Y, and Z happening. Hinduism's a little bit different. And as a result, it's not so tethered to whether something really happened or not. It's more philosophical, right? And when you have something more philosophical, it can kind of bend and shape itself to whatever is happening in that moment. And it's a great way to survive. I'm not sure it's a great way to really know what you are, right? Because then you have like a billion versions of yourself. Right? But it is a powerful way to survive. And one of the ways in which they've survived is with the advent of new scientific facts and truths coming into, emerging. They'll kind of adopt it into their faith and say, see this thing that we had in our faith, that was actually talking about that scientific thing all along. And it's just we didn't know it, and now modern science has revealed that that's what this really was. They're almost actively looking to find ways in which to embrace the new things that are happening, kind of in a way to almost validate, right? So it's a very different kind of setup than what has unfortunately happened over time in America, where they've been pitted as opposing forces, which it's a false dichotomy. I mean, I'll end with this. It's a positive note. Asa Gray, if you don't know, he's a botanist and a friend and pen pal of Charles Darwin at the time that Darwin was writing Origin of Species. Darwin really did not want to send his work across the Atlantic to America. He said, y'all are too religious, and you're gonna rake me over the coals for this work. I'm happy to just keep this over here in Europe. But Asa Gray read his work. Asa was a devout Christian, and as I said, a scientist and a botanist. He read his work and he said, wow, so brilliant. The lens that this gives me about the ways in which God might make things. Oh my gosh, it just opens up all the ways in which I can worship God now, right? He found it beautiful and wondrous. And he just thought, he began to see all kinds of interesting connections with Scripture, right? We think a lot about how long sanctification takes. God is God, why can't he just sanctify me tomorrow, right? Well, it's a process. A lot of things are a process. And he began to see, if biological life is a process, maybe there is some kind of interesting parable there for spiritual life. He began to see all kinds of interesting connections. They're still there, and there are still people that are talking about those kinds of things. It's just, unfortunately, they've been drowned out by the noise. Thanks for the question. Yeah.
You said that Hinduism does not make historical claims. What would you have to say about Krishna and also the scientific aspect of Vedantic knowledge in the Nyaya school as well? For them, the philosophical noise is actually scientific. Again, it comes to my notion of whether
Yes.
science is really bound by our current notions of technology.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So when I became a Christian in college, and prior to that was a practicing Hindu. And throughout my journey of reading about all the different faith traditions, major faith traditions, I should say, I was meeting with a Hindu priest during that time. One thing he told me at the end of our time meeting together was, Praveen, at the end of the day, anything goes. Okay, anything goes, right? And he was being a little bit cheeky, but he was also trying to convey that there is no one way to look at things. Now, that's not totally true. Like, if you really want to say, okay, I'm going to abide by Adi Shankara's approach to, Hinduism, the Vedanta, that there is an Atman and the Atman is one with the Brahman. That is a singular philosophy, right? So what I mean is more in common day practice, right? So typically speaking, when I speak with my, Orthodox Hindu family members and friends, some will say that it matters to them that Krishna was real, and others will say, I could care less that Krishna was real. Right? Much in the same way that when Gandhi was asked, right, who is your favorite teacher and what is your favorite book? He said, Jesus Christ is my favorite teacher and the Bhagavad Gita is my favorite book. Right? And the questioner, who was a British reporter, said, well, what if I could prove to you that neither Jesus nor Krishna existed? Right? And he said, wouldn't change a thing for me, because I still am moved to tears when I read the Sermon on the Mount as much as I am moved to tears when I read the Gita and Krishna talking to Arjuna, right? And so for him, it was about a philosophy and a feeling and maybe some other things wrapped up in that made sense to him, but the historicity of it wasn't central. Vivekananda also talks about this, right, in expounding on Hinduism, is that at times he will say, this is real and it happened, and other times he will say, it's not really that important whether it was real or whether it happened. It's a story that communicates some kind of deeper, truth and reality. So I don't mean to denigrate the faith tradition at all in terms of the depth of the things that it is saying about morality and humanity and things like that, but just that it's operating on a different dimension than other faith traditions sometimes, which hang themselves on a single historical event. It's unlike that. That was the only distinction I was drawing there.
I wish we could have 100 more questions. It's after 5:30. There's a reception. You should go back, have some food, and then speak with Praveen during the reception. So let's take it one more time.
Thanks so much.